I met Michael Alec Rose in 2004. I was introduced to him by the great American composer George Rochberg. The plan had been that I would do a tour up and down the east coast of the United States, playing a number of times in 2 weeks, George's Caprice Variations, his 90-minute cycle for solo violin. It was an amazingly inspiring tour for me, which also resulted in me breaking a molar in my right side of my jaw. I have a implant resulted from that tour to this day. That meant going to Nashville for the first time. And to be honest, I had no idea what to expect there. The very last thing I expected to meet was a composer like Michael. But the very first time we met, it was clear that his approach to music was extremely exciting. His music was very, very beautiful, but there was a completeness, all or nothing quality to his approach to art, which I found inspiring, exhilarating, infuriating, uplifting, overwhelming, and made me want to play and get involved in what he was doing. The first piece that he wrote for me was premiered the following year at Galleria Rufino Tamai in Mexico City, a piece called Three Short Obsessions. And from that very first moment of new work arriving, I started to become aware of how his work reached out, that it was, in order to play his music, it was necessary to understand that the purity, the sincerity of its utterance was absolutely fueled by its being grounded in his deep understanding and love for literature, for art, for language in all of its forms, and for the world, both natural and man-made. Michael approaches everything in a non-judgmental way, just as likely to get excited about a piece of pulp detective fiction as a poem by Rilke. In this, perhaps, we found common ground, in as much as I've always been very suspicious of what we might call great art culture. I've always felt that in order to appreciate and understand great music, for instance, it was necessary to understand all music, not to simply announce you were only going to play or be interested in that was great. If you can't take pleasure in things which are every day, then there's no way you're going to be able to understand the extraordinary, nor to recognize how the extraordinary is just as much to be found in the everyday and the banal as you might find it in the transcendent. Over the next few years, our collaboration deepened, both in terms of the new works which emerged, ranging from a string quartet based on paintings of gas stations, or petrol stations, through to duos for combinations ranging from two violins, violin and double bass, violin and viola, violin and cello, but most of all in a and a violin concerto, of course, but most of all in a series of pieces for violin and piano, which have become the, if you like, the communication to and fro between us, in as much as that, however much these are pieces which are designed and should be played by everybody, a lot of the substance of the musical material, what's on the score, is that which is, it refers back to communications between us, communications to which at any given time we are more or less privy to. Sometimes I know what's being talked about, and sometimes I have to dig my way into it, and then I realise that Michael is talking about something which we have shared, either an experience or a painting or a book. This, of course, means, because there's a great deal of shared territory, that there's a kind of incandescent quality to it. Sometimes we may agree hugely on what's being essayed, and sometimes we will disagree, and this is a good thing. I think there's a problem, particularly for those of us coming from the southern part of the British Isles, to approach things with a sort of tepid cup of tea quality of endeavour and engagement, ever scared of lighting the emotional blue touch paper that actual real human experience might tip over into or tip out from the artistic endeavour, and that we might be forced to actually express or feel something as opposed to wave vaguely in that direction. And so each of Michael's pieces, particularly, as I said, those pieces which are written in communication with me, is fraught, which is a word he loves dearly, with a plethora of messages to me. These range from a wonderfully gravid use of expressive marks, where an expressive mark, for instance, will give me instructions as to how to play something at the same time as referring beyond the frame of what is being discussed or musically into what it is referring to. I know Michael will want to speak to this. Or there will be Marguerite-esque puns written into the music, huge amounts of anagrams, palindromes, simophones, anything to engage with the player. The other elements were of shared interest, revolved around our deep love, our shared love for the countryside and for being outside. And I think we both treasure the memories that we have of walking together, whether it is with my then young son in Devon on a absolutely freezing, pouring rain on the Jurassic coast, or he and I walking amongst the grikes, the limestone grikes of the Western Yorkshire Dales, or in a cedar groves outside Nashville, Tennessee. I could go on, but gradually, and it took a while, it became obvious to us that this would become the substance of what we were going to do. And in the end of 2013, we embarked on an endeavour to bring that, if you like, perambulatory approach to walking around to what we did in our life as into music making itself. We have, I might say, different approaches to walking. And these different ways of walking meant that we had to learn to walk together or walk not together. The very first time that we walked in the countryside together was walking south from the Vale of Saffron in Essex, from Saffron Walden, across the, I'm not going to say rolling hills of Essex, but the gentle hummocks of Essex, where, to my surprise, I found that he was absolutely fascinated and delighted to find that he was walking through fields which were littered with flint, and I'd never met anybody who wanted to, and as he puts it, to pick up every single flint that he found. So, and I think it's worth saying that it means that our approach to walking reflects different ways that we experience things. I have a tendency to experience things in memory, and Michael has a tendency to experience things in actuality, in real time. Neither of these are wrong, but both of them have a function. But it also means that the place that we can share our experiences is in the artistic outcomes. So eventually he persuaded me that we should do a project based around Dartmoor, which he knows exceptionally well. And in 2013, we spent time, with him showing me around Dartmoor, walking, and then staying in a cottage on the moor, in the course of which a piece began to emerge in workshops, late-night workshops, after days of walking and often naturally nice suppers in pubs. Il Ritorno, which is a 40-minute cycle of pieces inspired by many of the ideas, the weather, the sounds, the smells, the stories, and the shared experience of being on Dartmoor together, as well, and I've noticed something he would want to speak to, the idea of song, the thing which is necessary to emerge after the walking has happened. More recently, works have emerged which reflect on our shared interest, for instance, in aspects of classical culture. A piece which he wrote for me was based on statues of Nereids in the British Museum, and were premiered next to them, and also pieces based on the idea of the medieval chapter houses of the UK. So far, and COVID has slowed this up a little bit, we haven't had the chance to do the chapter house performances, even though the piece has been played. One of them, Ex Cathedra, is directly inspired by the absolute wonder of the chapter house of Wells Cathedral and its environs, And so we're really hoping that at some point in the hopefully not too distant future, we'll be able to bring this extraordinary piece, where I've written my opinion, to Wells and put it in the environment which inspired it and to which it speaks. And that is an interesting point, which is quite how much, when a piece is inspired by a spirit of place, however much it needs to be in that space in order to exist. So, for instance, with the Dartmoor piece, the premiere of the piece was given in Morton Hampstead Church, the biggest church on the moor. And indeed, further from that, the commercial recording of the piece was made in that space. And to take it a stage further, the premiere of the piece was effectively seized upon by the local community. I don't think there are that many instances when a premiere of a multi-movement solo violin work can be greeted by large members of the local community with a standing ovation and a feeling that the piece of music that they just heard was theirs. But this was the case. And I do think that this is something of great value. It speaks to something which David Matthews, another composer with whom I've worked for many years, often speaks, which is the importance, in the broadest sense, that music should aspire to an idealistic vernacular, that it should be able to speak to its audience and speak to something that they value and recognize, as opposed to speaking away from them or over their heads. And this is something that Michael aims to do and succeeds in doing. The project which we're engaged on, or he's engaged on, but I think we're engaged on together, because this is very much a collaboration, is inspired by a landscape which so far I know not at all, which I'd like him to talk about, which is the landscape, the weather, the colour and the geology of Utah. Geology is something which is absolutely vital to his understanding of the world, his sense of stratification, he often refers to whether a conversation is igneous, for instance. In the speech he gave for my son's graduation party on Sunday, he made reference to very late the notion of a volcanic and igneous intellect, which I was absolutely delighted to hear when he was referring to my son. But now I have a fascinating situation. He has started sending me, and we're working on these new pieces together. We may talk about a little bit about one of them in the course of this conversation. But effectively, the introduction to the landscape is coming through the music. I have no sense of that part of America. It's one of the places in America I've never been. I've seen the photographs, and of course I recognize the landscape and the type of landscape from the photographs. But at the moment, the sense I have, if you like, is I have the work on Dartmoor as a primer. I can feel the relationship between the way that he wrote about that granitic landscape, and effectively what he's writing now is giving me a sense of the Utah landscape almost better than any photograph or movie or a recording could do. It has a verisimilitude which I understand. And that's where I'd like to leave this introduction. The idea that for musicians, we all speak music as our first language. However much we dearly love literature or poetry or mathematics or art, and however much those might also be our first languages, we must remember as musicians that music is a language which we speak articulately, and we should trust that we understand what it means. It's very fashionable, and perhaps musicology has been responsible for this, to present music to musicians as something that they don't really have the measure of, that they need other people to explain to them, that it's a language whose consonants and vowels they are able to form, and whose grammar they are able to mimic, and whose syntax they're able to utilize without ever really acknowledging that they actually understand the meaning, that somehow an industry has grown up pretending to musicians they need other people, experts, many of whom are not actually artists themselves, to articulate these meanings, to make it clear. I think all of us who've had the experience of playing happily to audiences who might describe themselves as not educated musically would know that the best audience for a piece of music is the person who thinks that they don't have the primer, they don't have the shibboleth for it, and just responds to what they hear. And I think it's that kind of truth of hearing, of playing and understanding, and the confidence of understanding the message, of the hidden messages and the meaning of something, which typifies the kind of lyrical beauty and integrity of Michael's music.